Okay, so this is a joint paper I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague Steve Coleman, who is an anthropologist who works on language issues in Ireland. The title of the paper is The Irish Gaeltacht as a Translocal Phenomenon, something I'll address particularly at the end. The term Gaeltacht is used in Ireland to refer to the place where the Irish language is thought to remain a community language. It's also used for, among ourselves, Irish speakers, as the sort of community of Irish speakers as well. Like Breton, Irish belongs to the Celtic family of languages. It's a different linguistic family from English, and although obviously, like a lot of minority languages, there is some influence in terms of vocabulary, particularly in Irish. So the two languages, Irish and English, remain formally distant, possibly more so than Breton and French, I would say. This means that monolingual English speakers face a relatively difficult task acquiring fluency in Irish, and that will have relevance to what I'll be saying in a minute here. In terms of the history, Ireland was colonised. You can see the retreat of the language under English rule. There were various measures taken at the time of colonisation to ban the language, to persecute poets and harpists in particular. So we arrive at independence, say around 1900 there, with Irish-speaking districts. The point is that the Irish language was a minority language within Ireland, within the island of Ireland, at independence in 1922. The state apparatus, the governmental apparatus, functioning in English. It continued to do so after 1922, but things changed insofar as the state declared a national aim of reviving the language. So restoration, revival of the language was the official policy at the beginning of the state. So in terms of other minority communities, I suppose I would say, I don't know if my colleague Steve would agree, I would say we have a slightly anomalous situation here where what is effectively a minority language, with its people in a minorized situation, yet you have full official recognition in the Constitution, all children learning the language at school, and an aspiration to the use of Irish as an official, practical, everyday language in institutions and so on. Since independence, Irish has made further steps forward. It is now a working language of the European Union. And in terms of agency and so on, it is important to note that this status was refused by the Irish government at accession to the European Union. They did not ask for it. Under the pressure of a popular movement in the early years 2000s, the government made that request, and Irish is now a working language of the European Union, and that has transformed its status in the eyes of a lot of Irish people who would not have been very impressed with it beforehand. The other thing which has made a big change, unlike other minority languages, was the arrival of an Irish language bilingual television channel in 1996, which has normalised Irish, particularly among those who don't speak the language. It broke down stereotypes and attitudes. Certain areas in green where Irish was a community language were declared to be Gaeltacht zones, so they are specified as specific Irish-speaking zones in 1925. With the effects of state policy and particularly migration and economic disadvantage, those areas, as you can see, retreated. That's the 1956 and current official areas in which Irish is spoken. It is spoken, of course, outside those areas, mainly now by networks. And that's why, if you like, we're into a new situation here where the government policy is still focusing on two things: the Gaeltacht traditional areas and schools. But if you like, things have moved on in terms of the actual Irish language, population. So the points that Steve wished to make particularly was, and I'll read his script: from the foundation of the state through the 1960s, Irish had strong ideological support, including its recognition as an official language. The fact remains that English continues to be necessary for access to most state services, if not all. The rural Gaeltacht areas were the recipients of special state aid, local development projects and so on. So these were generally introduced by the government. These are top-down initiatives which demonstrate to the speakers of Irish in these areas governmental support, of course. However, in the 1960s, with the opening up of the Irish economy and the post-Maastricht liberalisation of Ireland in the 1990s, ideological and material support for the Gaeltacht and for Irish language initiatives began to disappear. In keeping with the neoliberal ethos, the role of the state was refigured from activist intervention to basically a sort of arbiter, protector of minority rights, and the setting up of offices such as the Language Commissioner, who was set up to mediate between citizens and the state for the language. This Language Commissioner, based on the Canadian model, is an ombudsman who has the statutory power to enforce sanctions against violations of linguistic rights. However, the state and linguistic rights violations, particularly by state organisations and the civil service. However, given the practice that has persisted, the first Language Commissioner, Sean O'Connor, a former journalist, resigned after 10 years in office in protest against the continuing marginalisation of Irish in the state system. Now, in between times, the other thing which I suppose is relevant to us here is that there have been a number of bottom-up initiatives which have influenced the state. The state has officially declared for Irish. However, in order for the community to equip itself with, in many cases, some basic institutions, there have always been within the state, within Ireland, movements, bottom-up community movements, pressurising the state or even setting up alternatives to state bodies. I'll explain what I mean. For example, in the wake of the civil rights movements internationally in the late 1960s, a civil rights movement was set up for these Irish-speaking areas in 1969. One of the earliest things they did was to set up a pirate radio station. To have an Irish language radio station, they set up an independent one, which only lasted a very short while, but the state immediately moved to set up an Irish language one in order to keep control of the airwaves. The same exactly happened. The same individuals in some cases were involved in the 1980s in a campaign to create an Irish language television. So this is again about community bottom-up initiatives related to empowerment. And a third and significant move was the same Carta Civil civil rights movement also pressurised the government for an assembly, a sort of assembly body which would be a form of local government and industrial development and social development for these areas. This was accepted by the government, and they set up what they call Údaras na Gaeltacht, the Gaeltacht Authority. The original idea was that this would become a sort of an authority which would function as a sort of parallel local government for all these areas. Now you can see that they're in very different places, so this was going to be a particular structure. In the initial version proposed by the state, and which existed for 15-20 years, members were elected by the people. That has now been withdrawn, and the people are now the members of this board are now nominated by the government. The second thing which has happened in terms of the state rolling back this is that it was originally supposed to take on the functions of local government. Local government, in terms of the Irish language, has been, until very recently, very poor in terms of delivery of services to the citizens in their language, even when those citizens petition for that. So the local authority aspect of it wasn't really set up. The elections have been ended. There was a lot of political interference from political parties. In any case, there were problems with that issue. So this authority principally now looks after attracting industry and creating employment in these areas, and more recently in language planning. And again, the state has sort of flipped around in the post-Maastricht era. What is happening now, instead of top-down initiatives, is that the state has now entrusted, if you like, language policy to a certain extent to the communities in these areas and the surrounding towns, which have obviously a connection. They are the commercial centres for these generally rural, remote areas. They have also policy for the towns, and the policy is to be devised and implemented by local committees. So basically voluntary work. Instead of the state setting up institutions, they have turned this over to the communities and said to the communities, get on with this. They give you a budget, you appoint a language officer for each area, and get on with it. So that is the current trend of language policy. The other thing, however, in terms of progress that my colleague would also make from his anthropological standpoint, is the interesting question is, not the decline of the language, but why it still exists and what has enabled it to survive thus far. A major factor has been the role of these communities as social basis for a very strong and internationally influential cultural revival. Some people may be aware here of groups from the northwest of Ireland like Entan and Clonard who have achieved worldwide reputations. They are based in the Irish language, but if you like, their effect extends into music and dance and other artistic and craft media. Now, this has got a lot of prestige for the Irish language and for Gaeltacht culture, and has led to, if you like, the existence now of a cultural economy within these areas, based on cultural tourism, but also cultural activity and so on. The social movements have led to greater employment in these areas, thereby lessening the migration, the outward migration, which has been a traditional aspect of life in these areas, and which still continues. Within other areas, we have, as I say, the radio and television. There is a small number of other initiatives throughout the country in terms of, for example, the community radio, and so on. So there's been a certain amount of innovation in local control of resources, and so on. What I would say then, in terms of where we are now, is that given population movement, globalization as well, is that the game has moved on very much from this kind of map, this territorial geographical definition. The Irish language, the Irish speaking population, for example, I was brought up speaking Irish in Dublin, second generation. We're now into the third, fourth generation in some families. Throughout the whole country, you have, if you like, all Irish language medium schools outside these areas, Irish speaking families outside these areas, but outside Ireland as well. Because there's always been migration, heavy migration from these areas, you have Irish speakers of Irish grouped in certain places in North America in particular, smaller numbers in other cities in Europe, and they are organising, if you like, on in terms of identifying as groups, setting up activities and so on. So the issue that we face as a minority language is that the base and therefore the methodology will have to change, given that we are dealing with a globalized language which has a fair amount of internet presence and is being taught in a large number of universities in the North American continent, a number in Europe, as far afield as Japan and Australia, as well as in Ireland. So the game is changing, if you like, in terms of that, and we need, what is required is that further, if you like, structures which are deterritorialized, which will be generally, I suspect, bottom-up autonomous bodies will be set up in order to progress this, so that the diasporic aspect of it is now quite important. This is something we share, I believe, with many other minority languages in any case. So to finish then, in Ireland itself, these areas are very much under threat in terms of language transmission. Some areas are holding up relatively well, but the pressure of the English language as a world language, as you can imagine, this entire conference in English in Ireland, there's huge pressure on the language nonetheless from English. There is a risk that unless these bottom-up autonomy type initiatives and family transmission continue, that Irish will continue its path towards sort of a heritage language or a badge of identity, as Stefan said earlier. That's to say, a special register which the state is quite happy with, as a sort of register for literary, cultural and folklore performance in relatively formal or educational settings. This is not the life it has had until now, and hopefully will not be in the future.